gentlemen, welcome to Chalk Talk, the Pro Football Focus DFS podcast. I'm your host, Scott Barrett, and manning the co-pilot seat today is DFS guru Tyler Buecher. Last week, we went over our general preseason DFS strategy tips and also talked about some guys we were looking at in the upcoming slate. I hope you tuned in because if you had, hopefully, you were as profitable as Tyler was. Tyler, do you want to tell our listeners about your big day?
Yeah, it went well for me. I took second place out of a 24,000 person tournament. Helped boost my preseason bankroll and something I can carry over to into the regular season. You and I spent a ton of time researching the slate, and it really paid off. We mentioned it in the previous podcast. The harder you work, the more research you're putting in, the bigger the payout. And one of our hidden guys talked about during that pod was D.D. Westbrook. We mentioned that he was coming off a game where he had a big play, one catch, 40 yards for a touchdown. And in the fourth quarter of this past week, he just went off again and catapulted me up the leaderboard. Feels good.
Tyler, today we're going to talk about something a little different. You had this big tournament win, but today we're talking about cash games. Do you want to tell our listeners what it is that cash games offer that tournaments don't, and vice versa?
Sure. So from a macro perspective, we're looking at how much of your bankroll you're trying to play and what type of DFS player you want to be. So from your bankroll, you're looking at in a given week you maybe want to play, maybe 10% of your total bankroll. That's how much money you have put aside for the entire season. Not how much money you're willing to put back in after you lose X amount, but how much money you're wanting to go with for week 1 through week 17 or week 16, whenever you decide to stop, or the playoffs. But the big thing from that is you want to spend about 80% of your week 1 allotted budget in cash games, and you want to spend about 20% in GPPs. I personally am a big GPP player. I'm just looking for that once-in-a-lifetime payout, looking for the $1 million. But it's a lot more profitable and a higher recommended strategy to grind out the cash games, looking at head-to-heads, 50-50s, multipliers. Playing those games gives you a better chance of the long run to continuously make money.
So that's more just your overall goal. You want the money, the fame, the women that a single millionaire maker victory will bring. Whereas in cash games, you might be more profitable overall at the end of the year, but they come in smaller amounts. In a 50-50 double up head-to-head, you're really only going to make at most double whatever you put in. But it's a steadier grind, whereas a tournament player like Tyler could lose money in 5 consecutive weeks and then make it all back and then some in one big tournament victory. What about specifically within cash games? Head-to-heads are something I try and take a lot of. You notice in 50-50s and double-ups, if you're just above or just below the money line, that creates massive tournament-like swings for you. You're either basically almost doubling up your money or you could lose all of it. We're in a head-to-head. Let's say you lose 70% of your head-to-heads. You still get 30% back in those games that you win. It just reduces your week-to-week variance. But what about playing on different sites specifically? What are you looking at on DraftKings as opposed to FanDuel or Yahoo?
DraftKings, to start, has their full PPR scoring. They have the 3-point bonus for 100 yards rushing. They have a 3-point bonus for 100 yards receiving. And those are massive swings when it comes to cash games. If you start loading up on the stud running backs and wide receivers, and they're able to hit that 100-yard mark and get a touchdown, that can provide big dividends for you in your cash lineups. FanDuel is half PPR, and that strategy alters a little bit more. You want to target touchdown potential, I think. You want to put a little more weight into touchdowns on FanDuel. I think with the way the scoring's set up, you want to look for that's one of the sites where you're more willing to play Jonathan Stewart or Carlos Hyde, guys that might not have huge reception upside, but they're the guys that are going to be used in the goal line situations. Those are the big differences there between the two sites.
Yeah, I'm completely with you on DraftKings are more prone to chasing volume, whereas on FanDuel I'll weight touchdowns a little heavier. And we could talk about in a little bit about how to appropriately target those different numbers, like what to look for in each specific instance. Just with regards to cash game salaries, personally, I only like to make one lineup. If I'm really torn between one or two guys, maybe I'll make two, but I just want the best possible team I can make. Tyler, when you do cash games, how many lineups are you shooting for? Are you smiling because I just said do?
I am. I'm 5 years old. When I make cash games, I am looking at single lineups. I rarely do multiple ones. The only time I will is if there's similarly priced, I don't know, quarterback or tight end, and I like both of their projections for the week. I might try to divvy them up between my cash games just in case one tanks. But when I'm creating cash games, I'm looking at what I think has A, the safest floor, B, significant upside, and C, something I can put in with confidence that, okay, if I'm going to play 50 different head-to-heads, I feel like I can make a profit here.
All right, Tyler, I have to do it. You know it's coming. I have to shill just a little bit and pimp out our lineup optimizer, which is awesome. So you've been playing less cash games, and last season, towards the second half of the season, I shifted more towards tournaments myself. Typically, I was 80-20 player, strict bankroll, pushed that more towards 60-40. And I just noticed cash games were getting a little tougher, and I think that's due to the fact that there are a lot of sites offering lineup optimizers. But luckily, if you're a PFF subscriber, you have access to the best lineup optimizer in the business because we have the best projections in the business, because we have the best projection guy in the business. Our projections are handled by Jeff Radcliffe. He was Fantasy Pro's second most accurate fantasy ranker last season, routinely finishes in the top 10. And what our lineup optimizer does is it contrasts our projections with FanDuel, Yahoo, DraftKings salaries at each position on each slate to give you the best overall lineup. I don't know. I feel like that's cheating. So like last year, I barely looked at it. Towards the tail end of the season, I did. I wouldn't be a slave to it and just do the exact same lineup that PFF had. But I would look at it to see immediate values. And I think that's the best use for it. At least it was for me, was just to look at it, take a look at who our top values on each slate were, and see if I was missing anyone. Now that I'm done with that, Tyler, let's talk about 3x value. I hear that number thrown around a lot. Do you know what that means?
Sure. In cash games on DraftKings, that's what we're aiming for. What that means is, say Marvin Jones has a $5,000 salary. We divide that by 1,000, so that we're at 5, and we're looking for the 3x, so we're looking for 15 points from Marvin Jones. Normally, we want that 3x value because we're given a $50,000 salary on DraftKings, and that 3x gets us right around the 150 mark. Normally, in order to win cash games, you're going to need to eclipse that 150 mark. Sometimes it jumps up to 160, 165. Really good weeks, it could get up to 175, 180. Alternatively, it could get down to 120. But the 3x is a safe goal to target when you're building your projections and what you think each player can do. Scott, you want to talk about FanDuel?
Yeah, so I pulled this stat from TJ Hernandez, who I guess did over 3,000 head-to-heads on FanDuel last season, and he found the average score to be 117. So it's only about 2x you're shooting for on FanDuel. I guess that has to do with the lack of the point bonuses, maybe softer competition, tougher pricing. It's only half-point PPR. But yeah, so that's pretty much what you're looking for. And then in tournaments there, you're looking for about 3x. Tournaments on DraftKings, you're looking for about 4x. But it's just a general rule of thumb. You don't have to do it every single time. You can go more top-heavy. I actually don't like to do that on when I'm doing cash games. I'll go more top-heavy in tournaments. Really, in tournaments, I'm looking at I like a Ricky Bobby-esque approach. Shout out to Talladega Nights, where if you're not first, you're last, like in the DraftKings Millionaire Maker, only 25% of the field stands to win anything. But in cash games you kind of want a higher floor, but that's not to say you shouldn't be targeting upside as well because you need that too. Tyler, what are you doing here? You're primarily focused in a floor? How are you playing that careful balance of floor versus upside in cash games?
I'm doing both. I think you need both in order to successfully play cash games. You're looking for those 7 to 8 target wide receivers, guys that consistently get catches. You're also looking to chase the high upside guys who could score on any given play, like a Julio or a Martavis Bryant. Sometimes those guys aren't strictly GPP plays. I think you need a good combination.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the key with cash games specifically is just more so than tournaments. Just grab the best values at each position if you can. Just chase and target value. Whereas with tournaments, you're playing this game where you have to look at ownership percentages. You really need to be unconventional if you want to take down a top 10 spot in a big tournament. With cash, I'm just looking at the best values, grabbing the best values when I can.
Yeah, I think you nailed it right there with values. I think that's a big thing to target. Sometimes we see mispricing in DraftKings or FanDuel, and that's a great way to start your lineup, figure out guys that are must plays for you, mispriced plays in good matchups that you're anticipating a lot of volume. That's a great way to start your lineups.
I would also disagree that consistency is something I look into, but it just feeds back into values. Like this is something to look at when doing player analysis. A cool off-season article I did as part of my Metrics That Matter series is I looked at the most consistent players, and a lot of fantasy analysts have done this before. I did this by production, measured by week-to-week points, but I also did this based on role, measured by actual opportunity. So, for instance, last season, some of the most consistent players on a week-to-week basis by role was Ezekiel Elliott, DeMarco Murray, Le'Veon Bell, T.Y. Hilton, Frank Gore. The last two were a little bit surprising to me. They were consistent top scorers with a valuable role week in and week out. Home and away splits didn't matter. Neither did game script. Neither did the opponent. These were just super reliable players. If they're always take into account salary, of course, but these were guys where you typically knew what you were getting. Alternatively, guys like Doug Baldwin, Zach Ertz, Kenny Stills were far more high variant on a week-to-week basis and were more of GPP plays to me just because of these crazy swings of dud weeks versus crazy productive weeks. Yeah, Tyler, anything to add on that? Sorry.
No, I think there's a lot of merit in figuring out what type of player and what type of role a player has in an offense. If we're expecting Kenny Stills to get 4 deep targets a week, yeah, that's fine to chase in GPPs. But if he's only getting 4 to 5 targets total and he misses all 3 of those and is barely able to put together anything more than 2 catches and 40 yards, that's not going to do a ton for your cash lineups. That's something you'll learn as the further we go into the season. Roles are still being defined. We're still seeing it now in the preseason, and we'll help you here on the Chalk Talk.
I think we could break this down by positions in a little bit, but I just wanted to look at a few more just generalized tips. In cash games, I'm avoiding stacks. In tournaments, I'm all about it, pairing a quarterback with 1 or 2 of his receivers, but I try to do that a little bit less in cash. If I'm wrong on a single game, it's going to hurt me. I have to be really super confident to do that. Pairing a defense with a running back, I'll do that in cash games, sure. I don't think that's a big deal. What about you, Tyler? What are you doing there?
I agree. I'm just kind of echoing what you had here. I'm open to it, but it leaves you very vulnerable in case if it goes awry. But if it's the best play on the board, I wouldn't let that stop me. If Dalton and AJ Green are the must plays, I'm going for it.
I'm also kind of looking for a more balanced team, whereas in a tournament, I'd be more inclined to go super top heavy if need be, but I like a careful balance just in case, I spend up all this money on Le'Veon Bell and Julio Jones, let's say, and like one of those guys gets injured, that really puts me in a rough spot. Just a general rule of thumb, though, I wouldn't do that every single time. Late swap. I think that's the single biggest edge uh, or piece of advice anyone could take today, just because so many people neglect it. I don't get it. It's just the best way to try and make money. Uh,
Yeah, and what Scott means by that is leaving your flex play on DraftKings as the last game of the slate for possible swapping. Tying back into the ownership part that we had mentioned briefly, if you see that you're down in a head-to-head versus an opponent and it's before lock on the final game of the slate, don't be afraid to pivot if the situation calls for it. If you're like playing in a game, the Green Bay Packers versus the Baltimore Ravens, and you see you and your opponent each have one wide receiver left, you notice that he has $8K remaining salary, and you know that Jordy Nelson is 7,900. You also have Jordy Nelson. You're behind. You're not going to be able to catch him if you both play the same player. That's where it behooves you to pivot to a guy like Devontae Adams or Randall Cobb and a chance to eclipse him and win in that head-to-head. That takes some time, though. It's important to be in front of a computer, I think, to help you do that. And if you do it, though, it'll help you profit over the long run. And I think it's a very beneficial move.
One final note I wanted to add before just going specifically player to player. We see a lot of analysts talk about Vegas lines and how important it is to look at Vegas lines. And I definitely agree with that. Basically, you want a running back running behind positive game script. Teams are more inclined to go run heavy than a negative game script. If a team goes super pass heavy trying to catch up, the running back might not see another snap or might not be too heavily used at all, especially if they're a running back that gets taken off the field on obvious passing downs. Quarterbacks rely on efficiency more than volume typically. Tight ends are very touchdown dependent, so you want to look at are these teams favored? Do they have a high implied point total? But I also wanted to mention that, and again, this is more important on FanDuel, is that Vegas is wrong a lot. People think they're when they're setting these lines, it's exactly what they think is going to happen, but that's not true. They're also setting these lines based on how they think bettors are going to react. Like Dallas fans make up a huge portion of total NFL fans, and they love to bet on their team on Thanksgiving. But that's been a losing proposition each of the last 6 seasons. Over that span, each season, Dallas was favored and ultimately did not cover. Even in 2015, when Dallas was 3-7 against the undefeated Panthers, they were favored. Instead, look at our projected box score numbers. Each year I've looked at it, we've beat Vegas. They're super accurate. Look at that when trying to determine game script. Again, this is slightly more important on FanDuel, which lends itself to being a more touchdown-heavy format. On DraftKings, what are you looking at when you're chasing volume? What stats are important to you there?
Well, I think it depends position by position. And let's just start at, I guess, the quarterback position. We'll just run from there. Volume doesn't really matter as much in the quarterback position. In fact, volume is something you want to fade. You'd much rather target efficiency, as you mentioned. And as such, you don't necessarily need to pay up for production. Quarterbacks are one of the most consistent positions week to week. And pretty simple, I'm just looking for touchdown potential. Touchdown percentage is one of the most highly correlated statistics to fantasy points, and it correlates well to both DraftKings and FanDuel scoring. Focusing on opponents' red zone trips allowed and passing touchdowns allowed is a major target of mine. I'm also looking at high Vegas team totals and home favorites. They are also great things for me to target. What are you looking at the quarterback position besides those things?
Well, you hit on home favorites. I did an article last season looking at how to target streaming quarterbacks and for DFS, and my primary takeaway was more so than opponent, anything else, target quarterbacks for home favorites. That's going to play a role in salary, but maybe not as much as we might think, as home quarterbacks hit 3x value at a much higher rate than road quarterbacks over the past 2 seasons. Last year as well. Volume, like you said, not as important. A little bit more important on DraftKings due to the 300-yard bonus. But again, quarterback is like the one position where efficiency really trumps volume. I like to target mobile quarterbacks on DraftKings. Notice last season, all of the top 4 quarterbacks in 3x percentage ranked in the top 5 in rushing fantasy points per game. Tyrod, Cap, Dak, Rodgers, gives yourself a nice floor at the position. So when I can, I try and look at those guys.
Yeah, and a lot of the times they're not always the highest price guys. You can find Tyrod regularly priced low, and he provides a great option in cash games considering his floor. In just shy of 50% of his games, he rushed for at least 40 rushing yards, and right there is a passing touchdown. That's a great floor to go into the week with.
Completely agree. What about the running back position?
I think touches prevail, and it's the most important thing we should be looking at here, focusing on snaps, carries, receptions, and then red zone work. But touches are the main thing we're looking for. When we dive into specific running backs, the workhorse guys are the ones that we want to build our foundations around in cash games. The David Johnsons and Le'Veon Bells, you hear it often chimed and joked about on Twitter. Just DJ, Le'Veon, mash. Just mash them in cash and see what else you can build around them. And it's because they provide such a high floor as a receiving back and a rushing running back. Another type of player to target are the cheap running backs with heavy workloads due to injuries or suspension. We're seeing Darren McFadden coming in likely for Zeke week 1. He's not priced very affordably, but it depends on the site. Let me rephrase. But those are the type of running backs we're going to look for, guys that are thrust into immediate opportunities. And as we get further into the season, sometimes those injuries aren't announced until Tuesday or Wednesday when the salaries are already released. That provides massive edges, and that's where we should start our research around those terrific values. Another thing I'm looking for in running backs are home favorites. They are massive targets for me. Touchdowns are much more prevalent in these games. They also tend to be worth a lot more the further we get into the season. As the weather gets colder, home favorites produce far better results than running backs in other situations. And I'm also looking at possible punt plays at the running back position. When I'm looking at these punt plays, the guys I'm looking for are the receiving types like Bilal Powell, Theo Riddick, Chris Thompson. They may only get 8 to 10 carries, but if they can net you 5 to 6 receptions, they'll do more than pay off their 3x or 2x value on DraftKings or FanDuel.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is you can check out my article on bell cow running backs. I did a correlation between various different stats and fantasy production, and above carries and targets, believe it or not, snaps had the highest correlation to fantasy points, which I found was super surprising. But yeah, you just want to target and look for running backs on the field. Again, game script is super important. That can vary on the specific running back, like James White, Bilal Powell benefit more from negative game script, whereas Matt Forte, LeGarrette Blount last year benefited from positive game script. So I take those two things into account. The wide receiver position, go all out on targets. What's the plan?
Yeah, targets are the lifeblood of fantasy, and it is no different here in DraftKings or FanDuel. Opportunity reigns supreme, and we're looking for those heavy targets again on DraftKings for wide receivers. There's also the 3-point bonus for 100-plus receiving yards. That's another thing to target. You're given this $50K salary on DraftKings, the $60K on FanDuel. I think a big thing that most people do in cash games is either A, pay up for stud running backs, or B, pay up for stud wide receivers. Those are the way most people start as their foundation. Wide receivers that prevail are the guys that have high market shares, high targets, and an opportunity to score touchdowns. One major factor that comes into evaluating these plays is the wide receiver cornerback matchup. Scott, I know you know plenty of this. Would you like to dive a little more into it?
Oh man, So I'm all about this. I really think this is the greatest edge you can gain in DFS currently, because what you see is these salaries are based off of just general opposing defense. It's not breaking it down by specific cornerback, and in some cases that can be huge. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Maybe the wide receiver moves all around the line of scrimmage. It's just an average wide receiver versus an average cornerback, it's not very big at all. But at the extremes, when it's an above average wide receiver versus a below average cornerback or vice versa, that is huge for DFS. Definitely something you want to take into account. Check out our wide receiver versus cornerback chart available to Edge subscribers. Even before I started working at PFF, and I know you're the same way, thought it was worth the subscription alone. Look at it every single week. It breaks down wide receivers by where they're running their routes, left, right, slot. Cornerbacks by the same. Fantasy points per route for wide receivers, fantasy points per route allowed for cornerbacks. Definitely check that out. I think that's huge. Something I look at every single week to try and identify value.
Yeah, it's the best in the business, hands down. I've been referencing it for the last 3-4 years. I've been analyzing DFS plays. And the big reason is, as Scott mentioned, you see where these receivers and cornerbacks lining up and knowing where they do it and how often they could go against a bottom 25 cornerback is a massive way to get a swing in your wide receiver selection. There's not much more to say there. I think that the subscription alone pays for itself in your DFS plays.
All right. We've done enough free advertising for our employers. Let's talk about tight ends, because tight end was somewhere I struggled. I don't know. For the first 6 weeks of the season, I just couldn't get it right. Then I started having a little bit more success when I started paying down at the position, and I started chasing touchdowns. Do you think that's right? That's the right strategy there, Tyler?
Yeah, that's something what I've learned to do as well. Place a little more emphasis on red zone work for tight ends, specifically how much work they're getting inside the 10-yard line. The closer they get to the end zone, the higher the chance there is for scoring. One thing that I take into major account is the amount of red zone trips allowed by opposing defenses. That's something I like to hone in on. See how many opportunities the offense will get to get a chance to score. Because these tight ends aren't guys that are normally breaking off 80-yard plays. They're the ones who are the short 5-7-yard touchdown guys. And red zone work is huge. And honestly, it's because the receptions for tight ends isn't very consistent. The PPR scoring on DraftKings makes it a little more difficult for, the lesser tight ends, the Austin Hoopers, the CJ Fedorowitzes, to prevail and create cash unless they score a touchdown. Alternatively, if you want that safety net in a cash game or something, DraftKings makes you pay for it. The Greg Olsons of the world are pretty costly, and while they provide safety, you're paying up for it.
Tyler, you crushed that. I completely agree with you. Now let's talk about the two positions no one cares about, defense and then kicker.
All right, I'm just going to get kicker out of the way first because it's the worst. You just target high game totals, and that's it. All right, defense, special teams. They're incredible.
Oh, I actually disagree with you.
Oh, you want the low game totals?
No. Brian Malone did this great matrix earlier, I think actually last year possibly, but over a 10-season sample, he found that the thing most correlated to kicker points is the spread, how highly a team is favored, more so than total. Because when the total's too high, I think a lot of those points might be in extra points. I don't know. Basically, what's important is you don't want your team to fall behind too much and then have to start going for two or start going for it on fourth downs. I don't know. I think that's what it is. But yeah, so I guess maybe probably a little bit of both. High implied point total and heavy favorites.
Yeah, I would assume that you don't want to target the dogs. That makes sense.
But it's kicker also, so who cares?
All right, let's move on to defense, special teams. They're incredibly variable. Defensive touchdowns are what separates the field, but they're so hard to predict, and it's almost impossible to know who's going to score on a fumble recovery, who's going to get a pick six. So in order to do that, to get the best chance that we can, we're going to aim for the big plays like these interceptions, the sacks, the forced fumbles, by targeting poor quarterbacks and poor offensive lines. Guys that can get flustered in the pocket, offensive linemen that could get beat on the edge. Another thing I want to target is tempo. Say we're playing the former Chip Kelly-esque high-tempo teams. There will be more plays run against the defense, giving them even more opportunities to rack up those big plays. Pat Thorman does a weekly roundup that really helps identify these types of teams each year. And I think given more opportunities to rack up interceptions, sacks, forced fumbles, gives you a better chance to get that difference-making defensive unit. Another thing we want to look at is Vegas favorites. We keep beating the drum for this because Vegas has so much money at stake, a lot more than you and I.
I'm gonna argue for PFF's projected box scores, but I get it.
Fair enough.
But yeah, just chasing sacks and looking for teams that are projected to beat their opponents by a lot. And bad quarterbacks, yeah. Target bad quarterbacks, play the defense against them. All right, Tyler, before we end this podcast, I'm going to make a lame joke and then let you go on a little rant. Are you ready? It's really bad.
Yeah, fire away.
All right, so folks at home, we all know Garfield hates Mondays, but Tyler, he really hates Thursdays. You wanna tell them why, Tyler?
All right, this is by far the worst segue of any topic we've done so far. Okay,
I'm so proud of how bad that is.
What Scott is trying to get to is the different contests and slates available on DraftKings and FanDuel, where you can enter contests starting Thursday and they run all the way through Monday. A lot of other slates do Sunday early, Sunday late, Sunday all day. But the thing that I like to target in my cash games and my tournaments are the Thursday through Sunday slates. A lot of people love to see their players on TV. The reason why I like to heavily pursue those games is because they'll often go overweight to exposure just to get that itch scratched of watching Marcus Mariota throw his second touchdown. These guys are often overweight and they're often in suboptimal performances. They're coming off short weeks, normally on a Thursday, going from, say they played Sunday night, they only have 3-4 days before they have to get ready for the next game, and the coaches aren't able to create great game plans because of that. Their offenses are normally scaled back, and you don't often see huge performances. And what I like to do is just enter a ton of dummy lineups, players that aren't involved on either side of the Thursday night game, and just let everyone else play their guys, watch their guys, and then build all my lineups on Sunday. I think it's a great way to take advantage of the late swap and everything that DK has to offer.
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you. I especially care about it maybe midway to later in the season when players are a little bit more banged up and it hurts them a little bit more. If they're not coming off of a bye week, it means they just played Sunday or Monday, have fewer days to prepare, fewer days to rest up. So you tend to see less production as a whole, I feel, or at least less predictable production. All right, before we wrap it up, I think we have a few questions for today. This is a new segment on the show. Our first question comes from John in New Jersey. Tyler/Scott, would you rather pay up for running backs or wide receivers in cash games?
I'll start here. I think paying up for cash running backs is the optimal move. When we were talking about guys like Le'Veon and DJ, they have not only that high volume of rushing attempts that we're looking for, they also have that high receiving upside. I think last year they averaged, maybe 7 to 8 targets per game, something absurd. You just don't see that with other running backs, and I think they provide true outliers that you can rely on in cash.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think on FanDuel, running backs are a little more valuable than DraftKings typically, but even in PPR, like when it comes down to David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell versus everyone else, yeah, I'd rather pay up for them than the top 2 wide receivers. Let's say last year, Le'Veon Bell averaged the most fantasy points per game in PPR leagues over the past decade. But you know who was second? David Johnson in his 2016 season. This was a crazy historic year for fantasy running backs. There's little reason to suspect a fall off for Le'Veon Bell. And for David Johnson, his numbers might even go up. Bruce Arians is saying, and has said multiple times this offseason, he wants to get him to 30 touches per game. He might get injured at some point, but until then, I'm locking him into lineups every single week if I can, assuming their salaries don't just become 50% of your overall budget. What's our next question, Tyler?
Our next one comes from Sarah from Baltimore. She asked you if you had any preference towards a mid-range wide receiver versus a top-end cornerback or a low-end cornerback. How much that swings as far as not using guys in the polar extremes.
So that's when it gets a little trickier. Something I looked at this offseason was specific wide receivers who were more cornerback dependent than others, guys who historically dominate weaker cornerbacks, historically struggle against tougher cornerbacks. So that's something that I take into account. And then what also matters to me is I'll look at this wide receiver's targets per game, this cornerback's average targets allowed per route run, different things like that. So it's a lot of different variables where they line up versus where the cornerback lines up. Definitely check out my articles on this. Going to be writing about this a lot this season. Check out Jeff Radcliffe's articles on cornerbacks. No one does it better than him. But it's tough to give a straight answer on that. All right, well, I think that's it for today. Thank you everyone who tuned in and has been tuning in regularly to the Chalk Talk podcast. We will see you guys all next week talking about Tyler's favorite tournament strategies. You can find me on Twitter at ScottBarrettDFB. Tyler, tell the folks at home where they can find you.
You can find me on the twitter.com machine via at Tyler Buecher, Buecher.
All right, guys. See y'all next week.